All right, hi there. We are now going to talk about for loops. For loops are another conditional statement and another means for looping in a programming language. Now, for loops and while loops are really the same thing. There's absolutely no need to have both of them. It's really just a convenience to have a while loop for situations in which you don't know how many times you want to loop, and a for loop for situations when you do know how many times you want to loop. And by knowing how many times, I don't mean that the programmer knows exactly how many times the loop is going to run when the program's run, just that we know when the program is run, there will be information available to the program that tells it how many times to iterate. So for loops are great for counting. They're used very commonly when you're trying to work your way through a list or do anything that involves going through some kind of sequence. So let's just practice with some basic counting. And to change it up this time, we're going to start with JavaScript. So the basic structure of for loop is start with the reserved word for, and then we have a couple conditions that we need to worry about. Now, the most important one, because it's a conditional statement, is this, the condition right in the middle. When this is true, the code is executed. When it is false, the code is not executed. So it's the same thing as an if statement, same thing as a while statement. However, we have these two other elements, these two other parameters in this little segment of code here. The first is initializing what's called an iterator. This is the thing we're going to use for the counting. So when we were all little, we probably started learning how to count with our fingers. Our fingers were the iterator, is where we kept track of where we were in the counting process. As you get older, you keep track in your head, but you're still keeping track. The computer's keeping track with this variable I. So we're telling the computer, start counting at the number 0. We'll talk about why it's 0 and not 1. And then this last piece, I++, is telling it how much to count by. So it's very typical to count by ones. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I++ says increment I by the number 1. Just make it 1 bigger. Now, the important thing to know in the structure of for loops, and this is true in both JavaScript and Java, is that the pathway that the program takes is not all the way across this line at the first pass. So what's going to happen is the program gets to this line, sees that it's a for loop. It'll continue on and initialize the variable. Then it will continue on and check to see if that variable meets the condition or whatever the condition is. It doesn't actually have to use that variable, although it would be silly to use a for loop if that were not the case. And at this point, we don't go forward anymore. If the condition is true, now we go down to the code segment, execute it, and we get to the end of the code block. We go up, do this incremental step, and then go check that condition again. So the pathway is declare, check the condition, run the code, increment, check the condition again. So since we are starting with I equals 0, and 0 is less than 10, the first value we should log is the number 0. And when we increment, we'll go up to 1. We'll check again. 1 is less than 10, yada, yada, yada. Eventually, we're going to increment until we get to 10. 10 is not less than 10, so we wouldn't expect to see 10 printed down here. So we're going to see 0 through 9. If we run it, we'll see in the window, there we go, the number 0 through 9. Now, I mentioned that there's a reason we start at 0. Computers always start indexing things at 0. So if I had 5 things in a list, this would not be the first thing. It would be the 0th thing. This would be the first, second, third, fourth. So my list has a size of 5, but the indexes of the information in the list are 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's very, very common and usually the case that your iterator will start with 0. Now, because we went 0 and less than 10, we still got 10 numbers. Suppose, though, I just wanted to count the numbers 1 through 10. Then I would just initialize this to be a 1. And I would make this, instead of less than, I'd make it less than or equal to. And now I will get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Oops. I typed plus instead of equals. There we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now, because of these tiny little subtle issues, it's very, very, very easy to make a mistake like leaving the equal sign out and starting at 1. And in this case, I'm going to count 1 through 9. I'm only running this loop 9 times. This is what we would call an off by 1 error. It is super common in programming. It is very frustrating when you have an off by 1 error. But anytime you are you're counting or going through a list, or especially when using a for loop, you want to be very mindful of where your iterator starts, where it ends. So you don't want to have off by 1 errors. That could result in the last student in a roster never getting a report card. It could result in the first element of a list never getting printed to the restaurant's menu. So we always want to be mindful of that. Let's also pay mind to this last piece, what we're counting by. Suppose I wanted to count to 100, and we'll start with 1, and we'll actually go to 100. But what if I wanted to count by tens? Or actually, in this case, let's start at 0 then. So we're going to start at 0, and I want to count to 100 by tens. Well, I could just change this piece here, because if I left it like that, it's going to count 1 at a time. That's a lot of numbers. Whoops. What I could do, though, is say I plus equals 10, and now when I run it, I have 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 80, 90, 100. Now, this is actually 11 steps because I started at 0 and did less than or equal to. But I wanted to show you there's a little bit of versatility in using this for loop. So it is good for counting, but you can decide where to start. For example, we could have started at 50 and gone to 100. There we go. Now there's just 50 through 100. We can also count down. So maybe I want to start at 50 and say keep going while I'm bigger than 0, and let's subtract from me 5 at a time. So now this is going to go from 50 to 0 by 5s. Actually, that would have stopped at 0. So again, doing that off by 1 checks. Now it'll include 0, and we run 50, 45 all the way down to 0. Let's take a look at Java. Java has almost the exact same format. In fact, the only things that are going to change between JavaScript and Java is that I'm going to use int instead of var, so I'm going to have to declare it specifically as an integer, and my print statement's a little different. But here we are printing up 0 through 9. Let's try going to 100 by tens. I plus equals 10. And there we go. And let's go down. We'll start at 100. We'll go down to 0. And we'll still count by tens. And there we go. Now, let's take a look at Python. So Python's going to be a little bit different in format. You'll notice I don't have a parenthesis with those 3 terms. Instead, I'm going to create a variable, in this case x, or actually let's be consistent, make it I. So for I, I'm saying that I have this variable, so imagine there's an I, and for I, which is in the range from 1 to 10, print it. Let's see what happens. All right, I get 1 through 9. Now we have to use this range object here, which says give me a starting place, give me an ending place. And you'll notice the same thing happens. It actually drops off that last number. So in this range, the first number is inclusive, the second number is exclusive. It does not include that second piece. If we wanted to get to 10, we'd have a few options. We could bring this up to 11. That's one way to get to it. Or suppose we wanted to start at 0, we could do that. Or another option too is if we went from 0 to 10, and we count 0 through 9, so perhaps these would be indexes. Imagine if I had 10 things. They would be index 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. What we could do is take the index and then also print a different position. So we could say, for example, the position is I. Well, let's do this. Actually, it should be the index is I. And how about the position is comma, and then with parentheses, we can do I plus 1. So again, this is dealing with another form of off by 1 error. Whereas we might index things 0 through 9. If I were to list them on a piece of paper, I'd want to print the numbers 1 through 10. So now when we run it, we get the index is 0, but the position's 1. The index is 9, but the position's 10. Now, if you would like to, in Python, count by a different number, range function can still do that. You would just add a third term here. So count from 0 to 10 in twos, or by twos. And there we go, counting by twos. Or to be consistent, we were counting up to 100 by tens. All right, there we go. And then if you'd want to go down, so if you want to count down, you can use this other function called reversed and put that range in parentheses. And now all reverse is going to do is take the range that we already had, flip it around, and it'll behave the exact same way. So now we're going to count from 100 down. And notice, though, still 100 is not included. It is still exclusive. All right, that is a nice once over for loops. I should mention that for loops can also take different structures. For example, in Java, you can use what's called a for each loop, which has a slightly different form. It would look a little bit more like Python, where you'd say for each int I in a particular list. Or sometimes it would be like an object that would be in that list you would then iterate through, and we can get into that format another time. But suffice to say, for loops are for iterating when you know how many times you want to loop. While loops are for repeating something when you don't know how many times you want to loop. All right, bye now.